Paradise Lost. Introduction by Philip Pullman, 2005. A correspondent once told me a story, which I've never been able to trace, and I don't know whether it's true, about a bibulous, semi-literate, aging country squire 200 years ago or more, sitting by his fireside, listening to Paradise Lost being read aloud. He's never read it himself. He doesn't know the story at all, but as he sits there, perhaps with a pint of port at his side, with a gouty foot propped up on a stool, he finds himself transfixed. Suddenly, he bangs the arm of his chair and exclaims, "By God, I know not what the outcome may be, but this Lucifer is a damned fine fellow, and I hope he may win." Which are my sentiments exactly. I'm conscious, as I write this introduction to the poem, that I have hardly any more pretensions to scholarship than that old gentleman. Many of my comparisons will be drawn from popular literature and film, rather than from anything more refined. Learned critics have analyzed Paradise Lost and found in it things that I could never see, and related it to other works that I have never read, and demonstrated the truth of this or that assertion about Milton and his poem that it would never have occurred to me to make, or, having made, to think that I could prove it. But this is how I read this great work, and all I can do is describe that way of reading. The story as a poem. So, I begin with sound. I read Paradise Lost not only with my eyes, but with my mouth. I was lucky enough to study books 1 and 2 for A-level many years ago, and to do so in a small class whose teacher, Miss Enid Jones, had the clear-eyed and old-fashioned idea that we would get a good sense of the poem if, before we did anything else to it, we read it aloud. And so we took it in turns, in that little sixth form classroom in Yizgol Arudwi, on the flat land below the great rock of Harlech Castle, to stumble and mutter and gabble our way through it all, while Miss Jones sat with her arms comfortably folded on her desk, patiently helping us with pronunciation, but not encumbering us with meaning. And thus it was that I first read lines like this. Satan is making his way across the wastes of hell towards the new world he intends to corrupt, and a complex and majestic image evokes his distant flight. As when far off at sea a fleet descried hangs in the clouds by equinoctial winds, close sailing from Bengala or the isles of Ternate and Tidor, whence merchants bring their spicy drugs, they on the trading flood through the wide Ethiopian to the Cape Ply stemming nightly towards the pole, so seemed far off the flying fiend. Book 2. That passage stayed with me for years, and still has the power to thrill me. Ply stemming nightly toward the pole. In those words I could hear the creak of wood and rope, the never-ceasing dash of water against the bows, the moan of the wind in the rigging. I could see the dim phosphorescence in the creaming wake, the dark waves against the restless horizon, the constant stars in the velvet sky, and I saw the vigilant helmsman, the only man awake, guiding his sleeping shipmates and their precious freight across the wilderness of the night. To see these things and hear them most vividly, I found that I had to take the lines in my mouth and utter them aloud. A whisper will do. You don't have to bellow it and annoy your neighbors, but air has to pass across your tongue and through your lips. Your body has to be involved. Through many a dark and dreary vale they passed, and many a region dolorous, over many a frozen, many a fiery Alp, rocks, caves, lakes, fens, bogs, dens, and shades of death, a universe of death, which God by curse created evil, for evil only good, where all life dies, death dies, and nature breeds, perverse, all monstrous, all prodigious things, abominable, inutterable, and worse than fables yet have feigned, or fear conceived, gorgons, and hydras, and chimeras dire. Book 2. The experience of reading poetry aloud when you don't fully understand it is a curious and complicated one. It's like suddenly discovering that you can play the organ. Rolling swells and peals of sound, powerful rhythms and rich harmonies are at your command, and as you utter them, you begin to realize that the sound you're releasing from the words as you speak is part of the reason they're there. The sound is part of the meaning, and that part only comes alive when you speak it. So at this stage, it doesn't matter that you don't fully understand everything. You're already far closer to the poem than someone who sits there in silence, looking up meanings and references and making assiduous notes. By the way, someone who does that while listening to music through earphones will never understand it at all. We need to remind ourselves of this, especially if we have anything to do with education. I have come across teachers and student teachers whose job was to teach poetry, but who thought that poetry was only a fancy way of dressing up simple statements to make them look complicated, and that their task was to help their pupils translate the stuff into ordinary English. When they'd translated it, when they understood it, the job was done. It had the effect of turning the classroom into a torture chamber, in which everything that made the poem a living thing had been killed and butchered. No one had told such people that poetry is in fact enchantment, that it has the form it does because that very form casts a spell, and that when they thought they were bothered and bewildered, they were in fact being bewitched, and if they let themselves accept the enchantment and enjoy it, they would eventually understand much more about the poem. But if they never learn this truth themselves, they can't possibly transmit it to anyone else. Instead, in an atmosphere of suspicion, resentment, and hostility, many poems are interrogated until they confess, and what they confess is usually worthless, as the results of torture always are. Broken little scraps of information, platitudes, banalities. Never mind. The work has been done according to the instructions, and the result of the interrogation is measured and recorded and tabulated in line with government targets, and this is the process we call education. However, as I say, I was lucky enough to learn to love Paradise Lost before I had to explain it. Once you do love something, the attempt to understand it becomes a pleasure rather than a chore. And what you find when you begin to explore Paradise Lost in that way is how rich it is in thought and argument. You could make a prose paragraph of it that would still be a work of the most profound and commanding intellectual power. But the poetry, its incantatory quality, is what makes it a great work of art. I found, in that classroom so long ago, that it had the power to stir a physical response. My heart beat faster, the hair on my head stirred, my skin bristled. Ever since then, that has been my test for poetry, just as it was for A.E. Houseman, who dared not think of a line of poetry while he was shaving, in case he cut himself. The poem as a story. The question, where should my story begin, is, as every storyteller knows, both immensely important and immensely difficult to answer. Once upon a time, as the fairy tale formula has it, but once upon a time there was what? The opening governs the way you tell everything that follows, not only in terms of the organization of the events, but also in terms of the tone of voice that does the telling. And not least, it enlists the reader's sympathy in this cause rather than that. Alfred Hitchcock once pointed out that if a film opens with a shot of a burglar breaking into a house and ransacking the place, and then, with him, we see through the bedroom window the lights of a car drawing up outside, we think, hurry up, get out, they're coming. So, when the story of Paradise Lost begins, after the invocation to the heavenly muse, we find ourselves in hell, with the fallen angels groaning on the burning lake. And from then on, part of our awareness is always affected by that. This is a story about devils. It's not a story about God. The fallen angels and their leader are our protagonists, and the unfallen angels, and God the Father and the Son and Adam and Eve are all supporting players. And we begin in medias res, in the middle of the action, with the first great battle lost, and the rebel angels just beginning to recover their senses after their vertiginous fall. What an opening, and what scenery. Satan first looks around at the dismal situation, waste and wild, a dungeon horrible, on all sides round as one great furnace flamed, yet from those flames no light, but rather darkness visible, served only to discover sights of woe, regions of sorrow, doleful shades, where peace and rest can never dwell. Hope never comes, that comes to all, but torture without end still urges, and a fiery deluge, fed with ever-burning sulphur unconsumed. Book 1. C.S. Lewis remarks that for many readers, it's not just the events of the story that matter, it's the world that the story conjures up. In his own case, he loved the leather-stocking tales of James Fenimore Cooper, not just for the momentary suspense, but that whole world to which it belonged, the snow and the snowshoes, beavers and canoes, warpaths and wigwams and Hiawatha names. The same is true for some writers of stories. They are drawn to a particular atmosphere, a particular kind of landscape. They want to wander about in it and relish its special tastes and sounds, even before they know what kind of story they're going to tell. Whether Milton worked like that, I don't know, but it's easy to see that his imagination delighted in the scenery of hell, and we see that from the very beginning, with Satan surveying his dungeon horrible. Books 1 and 2 are full of these magnificent and terrifying landscapes, and when the tale reaches paradise itself in Book 4, the descriptions reach a peak of sensuous delight that we can almost taste. But landscapes and atmospheres aren't enough for a story. Something has to happen. And it helps the tightness and propulsion of the story enormously if it's the protagonist himself who sets the action going, who takes the initiative. It also encourages our interest in the protagonist to develop into admiration. That is exactly what happens here, as the fallen angels, who are devils now, gather themselves after their great fall and begin to plot their revenge. Revenge is one of the great story themes, of course, and it's inspired storytellers of every rank and in every age, from Homer and Aeschylus and Shakespeare to Geoffrey Archer. The interest here is in how Milton handles the narrative. How well does he tell the story? I think it could hardly be told any better. After their first struggle on the burning lake, the fallen angels hold a great debate in Pandemonium, where the characters of their leaders are vividly revealed. Moloch, the fearless, savage warrior; Belial, graceful, false, and hollow, counseling ignoble ease and peaceful sloth; Mammon, intent only on gold and riches; and then Beelzebub, majestic though in ruin, who sums up all the preceding arguments and then points the way to another world altogether, the happy seat of some new race called man, and suggests that they make that the target of their vengeance. We can see and hear the plan taking shape. We can feel the surge of determination and energy it brings, and inevitably that makes us curious to know how they'll bring it up. There is a sort of curiosity that isn't short-circuited by our knowledge of how things did, in fact, turn out. Frederick Forsyth's The Day of the Jackal demonstrates that although we know full well that General de Gaulle was not assassinated, we are still eager to read about how he might have been. And Milton is careful to remind us that it was Satan himself who first thought of this plan, and it is Satan who sets out across the wastes of hell to find his way to the new world. The hero is firmly in charge. If the opening of a story is important, the closing of one part of it, a chapter, a canto, is important in a different way. The purpose here is to charge the forthcoming pause with tension and expectation. Popular storytellers have always had a firm grasp of this principle. It's exactly what Conan Doyle does, for example, at the end of the first episode of The Hound of the Baskervilles in the Strand magazine for August 1901. Dr. Mortimer has just been describing the mysterious death of Sir Charles Baskerville and mentions the footprints nearby. "A man's or a woman's?" asks Holmes, and Dr. Mortimer replies, "Mr. Holmes, they were the footprints of a gigantic hound." There, the episode ends. There was no shortage of eager buyers for the September issue. Storytelling principles hold true, whatever the subject, whatever the medium. Time the pause right, and the audience will be eager for what follows. The break after the end of the second book of Paradise Lost is powerfully charged with tension, because it obeys that principle. After his journey to the gates of hell and his encounter with sin and death, Satan sees the distant vastness of heaven, and fast by hanging in a golden chain this pendant world, in a bigness as a star of smallest magnitude close by the moon, thither full fraught with mischievous revenge, accursed, and in a cursed hour he hies. And there Book 2 ends, and we pause with that image in our minds. This newly created world, suspended in its golden chain, so beautiful and fresh, knows nothing of what is coming towards it. But we know. To cite Alfred Hitchcock again, who knew more about suspense than most other storytellers, you can depict four men sitting around a table, calmly playing cards, and the audience will be on the edge of their seats with tension, as long as the audience knows what the card players don't, namely that there is a bomb under the table about to go off. Milton knew that too. There are examples of his great storytelling power all the way through, far too many to mention here, but one we should look at is the very end of the poem. Like the beginning, the end of the story is such an important place that it has a traditional formulaic tag, but "and they lived happily ever after" certainly won't do in this case. Adam and Eve have chosen to disobey the explicit command of God, and the consequences of this have been laid out for them not only by their own experience of guilt and shame, but by the narrative of the future they've heard from the angel Michael. They must leave Eden. Paradise is now irrecoverably lost. There is a part of the story that has often been illustrated, and in a picture the scene is indeed intensely dramatic, with the man and woman in tears and the angel with the fiery sword expelling them, just the only tent and its influence. A poem is not a lecture. A story is not an argument. The way poems and stories work on our minds is not by logic, but by their capacity to enchant, to excite, to move, to inspire. To be sure, a sound intellectual underpinning helps the work to stand up under intellectual questioning, as Paradise Lost certainly does, but its primary influence is on the imagination. So it was, for instance, with the greatest of Milton's interpreters, William Blake, for whom the author of Paradise Lost was a lifelong inspiration. "Milton loved me in childhood and showed me his face," he claimed, and in The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, he wrote what is probably the most perceptive and certainly the most succinct criticism of Paradise Lost. The reason Milton wrote in fetters when he wrote of angels and God, and at liberty when of devils and hell, is because he was a true poet and of the devil's party without knowing it. And Blake's continuing and passionate interest in Milton resulted in a long and, frankly, difficult poem named after the poet, as well as a series of illustrations to Paradise Lost, which are some of the most delicate and beautiful watercolors he ever did. Other poets at the same period felt the influence of Milton, Wordsworth in particular, who began one of his sonnets with the words, "Milton, Thou shouldst be living at this hour. England hath need of thee. And very near the beginning of his own great long poem, The Prelude, Wordsworth deliberately echoes the phrase in the closing lines of Paradise Lost, "The earth is all before me," as if he's taking hold of a torch passed to him by Milton. Today, nearly 3.5 centuries after Paradise Lost was first published, it is more influential than ever. 2 separate dramatic adaptations have recently played on the stage in Britain, and only this morning I opened my post to find an American retelling of it, with attractive watercolor illustrations in an edition for children. It will not go away. In my own case, the trilogy I called His Dark Materials, stealing that very phrase from Book 2, with due acknowledgement in the epigraph, began partly with my memories of reading the poem aloud at school so many years before. As I talked to my publisher, I discovered that he too remembered studying it in the 6th form, and we sat at the lunch table swapping our favorite lines, and by the time we'd finished, I seemed to have agreed to write a long fantasy for young readers, which would, at least partly, we hoped, evoke something of the atmosphere we both loved in Paradise Lost. So it was the landscape, the atmosphere, that was my starting point. But as the narrative began to form itself on the page, I found that, perhaps drawn by the gravitational attraction of a much greater mass, I was beginning to tell the same story too. I wasn't worried about that, because I was well aware that there are many ways of telling the same story, and that this story was a very good one in the first place, and could take a great deal of retelling. Inevitably, the storyteller's own preoccupations became visible in the emphasis and the coloring that they give to this or that aspect of the tale. In my case, I found that my interest was most vividly caught by the meaning of the temptation and fall theme. Suppose that the prohibition on the knowledge of good and evil were an expression of jealous cruelty, and the gaining of such knowledge an act of virtue. Suppose the fall should be celebrated and not deplored. As I played with it, my story resolved itself into an account of the necessity of growing up, and a refusal to lament the loss of innocence. The true end of human life, I found myself saying, was not redemption by a non-existent son of God, but the gaining and transmission of wisdom. Innocence is not wise, and wisdom cannot be innocent. And if we are going to do any good in this world, we have to leave childhood behind. That is how one modern writer told this great story. It will certainly be told many times again, and each time differently. I think it is the central story of our lives, the story that more than any other tells us what it means to be human. But however many times it is told in the future, and however many different interpretations are made of it, I don't think that the version created by Milton, blind and aging, out of political favor, dictating it day by day to his daughter, will ever be surpassed. The verse. The measure is English heroic verse without rhyme, as that of Homer in Greek and of Virgil in Latin, rhyme being no necessary adjunct or true ornament of poem or good verse, in longer works especially, but the invention of a barbarous age, to set off wretched matter and lame metre, graced indeed since by the use of some famous modern poets carried away by custom, but much to their own vexation, hindrance, and constraint to express many things otherwise, and for the most part worse than else they would have expressed them. Not without cause, therefore, some both Italian and Spanish poets of prime note have rejected rhyme, both in longer and shorter works, and have also long since our best English tragedies, as a thing of itself to all judicious ears, trivial and of no true musical delight, which consists only in apt numbers, fit quality of syllables, and in the sense variously drawn out from one verse into another, not in the jingling sound of like endings, a fault avoided by the learned ancients both in poetry and all good oratory. This neglect, then, of rhyme so little is to be taken for a defect, though it may seem so perhaps to vulgar readers that it is rather to be esteemed an example set, the first in English, of ancient liberty recovered to heroic poem from the troublesome and modern bondage of rhyming. Book 1. I love the audacity of this opening. The sheer nerve of Milton's declaring that he's going to pursue things unattempted yet in prose or rhyme, to justify the ways of God to men. How could anyone fail to thrill at a story that begins like this? How could any reader not warm to a poet who dares to say it? As the story begins, we meet the rebel angels as they lie stunned and vanquished on the burning lake in hell. Surely there's no way out for them. But when we read the great descriptions of Satan calling his legions together, with his shield hanging on his shoulders like the moon, and his spear mightier than the tallest pine, we realize that the story is in safe hands. The rebels raise the palace of Pandemonium, with its monstrous grandeur, and gather to decide what they should do. They haven't been destroyed. War, open or understood, must be resolved. Philip Pullman. The argument. This first book proposes, first in brief, the whole subject, man's disobedience, and the loss thereupon of paradise wherein he was placed, then touches the prime cause of his fall, the serpent, or rather Satan in the serpent, who, revolting from God and drawing to his side many legions of angels, was by the command of God driven out of heaven with all his crew into the great deep. Which action passed over, the poem hastes into the midst of things, presenting Satan with his angels now fallen into hell, described here, not in the center, for heaven and earth may be supposed as yet not made, certainly not yet accursed, but in a place of utter darkness, fitliest called chaos. Here, Satan with his angels lying on the burning lake, thunderstruck and astonished, after a certain space recovers, as from confusion, calls up him who next in order and dignity lay by him, and they confer of their miserable fall. Satan awakes all his legions, who lay till then in the same manner confounded. They rise, their numbers, array of battle, their chief leaders' name, according to the idols known afterwards in Canaan and the countries adjoining. To these Satan directs his speech, comforts them with hope yet of regaining heaven, but tells them lastly of a new world and a new kind of creature to be created, according to an ancient prophecy or report in heaven, for that angels were long before this visible creation was the opinion of many ancient fathers. To find out the truth of this prophecy, and what to determine thereon, he refers to a full council, what his associates thence attempt. Pandemonium, the palace of Satan, rises, suddenly built out of the deep. The infernal peers there sit in council. Book 1. Of man's first disobedience, and the fruit of that forbidden tree, whose mortal taste brought death into the world, and all our woe, with loss of Eden, till one greater man restore us, and regain the blissful seat, sing heavenly muse, that on the secret top of Oreb or of Sinai didst inspire that shepherd, who first taught the chosen seed, in the beginning, how the heavens and earth rose out of chaos, or if Sion hill delight thee more, and Siloa's brook that flowed fast by the oracle of God, I thence invoke thy aid to my adventurous song, that with no middle flight intends to soar above the Aeonian mount, while it pursues things unattempted yet in prose or rhyme. And chiefly thou, O Spirit, that dost prefer before all temples the upright heart and pure, instruct me, for thou knowest, thou from the first wast present, and with mighty wings outspread, dove-like, satst brooding on the vast abyss, and madst it pregnant. What in me is dark, illumine. What is low, raise and support, that to the height of this great argument I may assert eternal providence, and justify the ways of God to men. Say first, for heaven hides nothing from thy view, nor the deep tract of hell. Say first what cause moved our grandparents in that happy state, favoured of heaven so highly, to fall off from their Creator, and transgress his will for one restraint, lords of the world besides. Who first seduced them to that foul revolt? The infernal serpent. He it was, whose guile stirred up with envy and revenge, deceived the mother of mankind, what time his pride had cast him out from heaven, with all his host of rebel angels, by whose aid aspiring to set himself in glory above his peers, he trusted to have equalled the Most High, if he opposed, and with ambitious aim against the throne and monarchy of God, raised impious war in heaven, and battle proud with vain attempt. Him the almighty power hurled headlong, flaming from the ethereal sky, with hideous ruin and combustion down to bottomless perdition, there to dwell in adamantine chains and penal fire, who durst defy the omnipotent to arms. 9 times the space that measures day and night to mortal men, he with his horrid crew lay vanquished, rolling in the fiery gulf, confounded though immortal, but his doom reserved him to more wrath, for now the thought both of lost happiness and lasting pain torments him. Round he throws his baleful eyes that witnessed huge affliction and dismay, mixed with obdurate pride and steadfast hate. At once, as far as angels can, he views the dismal situation, waste and wild, a dungeon horrible, on all sides round as one great furnace flamed, yet from those flames no light, but rather darkness visible, served only to discover sights of woe, regions of sorrow, doleful shades, where peace and rest can never dwell, hope never comes, that comes to all, but torture without end still urges, and a fiery deluge, fed with ever-burning sulphur unconsumed. Such place eternal justice had prepared for these rebellious, here their prison ordained in utter darkness, and their portion set as far removed from God and light of heaven as from the centre thrice to the utmost pole. Oh, how unlike the place from whence they fell! There the companions of his fall, o'erwhelmed with floods and whirlwinds of tempestuous fire, he soon discerns, and weltering by his side, one next to himself in power, and next in crime, long after known in Palestine and named Beelzebub, to whom the arch-enemy, and thence in heaven called Satan, with bold words breaking the horrid silence, thus began. If thou beest he, but oh, how fallen, how changed from him who in the happy realms of light, clothed with transcendent brightness, did outshine myriads thro' bright, if he whom mutual league, united thoughts and counsels, equal hope and hazard in the glorious enterprise joined with me once, now misery hath joined in equal ruin, into what pit thou seest, from what height thou fallen, so much the stronger proved he with his thunder. Until then, who knew the force of those dire arms? Yet not for those, nor what the potent victor in his rage can else inflict, do I repent or change, though charged in outward lustre, that fixed mind and high disdain, from sense of injured merit, that with the mightiest raised me to contend, and to the fierce contention brought along innumerable force of spirits armed that durst dislike his reign, and me preferring. His utmost power with adverse power opposed in dubious battle on the plains of heaven, and shook his throne. What though the field be lost? All is not lost. The unconquerable will and study of revenge, immortal hate, and courage never to submit or yield, and what is else not to be overcome. That glory never shall his wrath or might extort from me. To bow and sue for grace with suppliant knee, and deify his power, who from the terror of this arm so late doubted his empire, that were low indeed, that were in ignominy and shame beneath this downfall, since by fate the strength of gods and this ethereal substance cannot fail, since though experience of this great event, in arms not worse, in foresight much advanced, we may with more successful hope resolve to wage by force or guile eternal war, irreconcilable to our grand foe, who now triumphs, and in the excess of joy sole reigning holds the tyranny of heaven. So spake the apostate angel, though in pain, vaunting aloud, but racked with deep despair, and him thus answered soon his bold compeer. O Prince, O Chief of many throned powers, that led the embattled seraphim to war under thy conduct, and in dreadful deeds fearless endangered heaven's perpetual king, and put to proof his high supremacy, whether upheld by strength or chance or fate, too well I see and rue the dire event, that with sad overthrow and foul defeat hath lost us heaven, and all this mighty host in horrible destruction laid thus low, as far as gods and heavenly essences can perish. For the mind and spirit remains invincible, and vigor soon returns, though all our glory extinct, and happy state here swallowed up in endless misery. But what if he our conqueror, whom I now of force believe almighty, since no less than such could have overpowered such a force as ours, have left us to this our spirit and strength entire strongly to suffer and support our pains, that we may so suffice his vengeful ire, or do him mightier service as his thralls by right of war, whatever his business be, here in the heart of hell to work in fire, or do his errands in the gloomy deep. What can it then avail, though yet we feel strength undiminished, or eternal being to undergo eternal punishment? Whereto, with speedy words, the archfiend replied. Fallen cherub, to be weak is miserable, doing or suffering, but of this be sure, to do aught good never will be our task, but ever to do ill our sole delight, as being the contrary to his high will whomst we resist. If then his providence out of our evil seek to bring forth good, our labour must be to pervert that end, and out of good still to find means of evil, which ofttimes may succeed, so as perhaps shall grieve him. If I fail not, and disturb his inmost counsels from their destined aim. But see, the angry victor hath recalled his ministers of vengeance and pursuit back to the gates of heaven. The sulphurous hail shot after us in storm, o'erblown hath laid the fiery surge, that from the precipice of heaven received us falling, and the thunder, winged with red lightning and impetuous rage, perhaps hath spent his shafts, and ceases now to bellow through the vast and boundless deep. Let us not slip the occasion, whether scorn or satiate fury yield it from our foe. Seest thou yon dreary plain forlorn and wild, the seat of desolation, void of light, save what glimmering of these livid flames casts pale and dreadful? Thither let us tend from off the tossing of these fiery waves. There rest, and if any rest can harbour there, and reassembling our afflicted powers, consult how we may henceforth most offend our enemy, our own loss how repair, how overcome this dire calamity, what reinforcement we may gain from hope. if not what resolution from despair. Thus, Satan talking to his nearest mate, with head uplift above the wave, and eyes that sparkling blazed, his other parts besides prone on the flood, extended long and large, lay floating many a rood, in bulk as huge as whom the fables name of a monstrous size, Titanian or earthborn, that warred on Jove, Briareos or Typhon, whom the den by ancient Tarsus held, or that sea-beast Leviathan, which God of all his works created hugest, that swim the ocean stream, him haply slumbering on the Norway foam, the pilot of some small night-founded skiff, deeming some island, oft, as seamen tell, with fixed anchor in his scaly rind, moors by his side under the lee, while night invests the sea, and wished morn delays. So stretched out huge in length the arch-fiend lay, chained on the burning lake, nor ever thence had risen or heaved his head, but that the will and high permission of all-ruling heaven left him at large to his own dark designs, that with reiterated crimes he might heap on himself damnation, while he sought evil to others, and enraged might see how all his malice served but to bring forth infinite goodness, grace, and mercy shown on man by him seduced, but on himself treble confusion, wrath, and vengeance poured. Forthwith upright he rears from off the pool his mighty stature, on each hand the flames driven backwards slope their pointing spires, and rolled in billows, leave the mist in a horrid veil. Then with expanded wings he steers his flight aloft, incumbent on the dusky air that felt unusual weight, till on dry land he lights, if it were land that ever burned with solid as the lake with liquid fire, and such appeared in hue as when the force of subterranean wind transports a hill torn from Pelorus, or the shattered side of thundering Aetna, whose combustible and fueled entrails thence conceiving fire, sublimed with mineral fury, aid the winds, and leave a singed bottom all involved with stench and smoke. Such resting found the soul of unblessed feet. Him followed his next mate, both glorying to have scaped the Stygian flood as gods, and by their own recovered strength, not by the sufferance of supernal power. Is this region, this the soil, the clime, said then the lost archangel, this the seat that we must change for heaven, this mournful gloom for that celestial light? Be it so, since he who now is sovereign can dispose and bid what shall be right. Furthest from him is best, whom reason hath equalled, force hath made supreme above his equals. Farewell, happy fields where joy forever dwells. Hail horrors, hail infernal world, and thou profoundest hell receive thy new possessor. One who brings a mind not to be changed by place or time, can make a heaven of hell, a hell of heaven. What matter where, if I be still the same, and what I should be, all but less than he whom thunder hath made greater? Here at last we shall be free. The Almighty hath not built here for his envy, will not drive us hence. Here we may reign secure, and in my choice, to reign is worth ambition though in hell. Better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. But wherefore let we then our faithful friends, the associates and co-partners of our loss, lie thus astonished on the oblivious pool, and call them not to share with us their part in this unhappy mission, or once more with rallied arms to try what may yet be regained in heaven, or what more lost in hell. So Satan spake, and him Beelzebub thus answered. Leader of those armies bright, which but the omnipotent none could have foiled, if once they hear that voice, their liveliest pledge of hope in fears and dangers, heard so oft in worst extremes and on the perilous edge of battle when it raged. In all assaults, their surest signal, they whilst soon resume new courage and revive, though now they lie grovelling and prostrate on yon lake of fire. As we erewhile, astounded and amazed, no wonder, fallen such a pernicious height. He scarce had ceased when the superior fiend was moving towards the shore, his ponderous shield, ethereal temper, massy, large, and round. Behind him cast, the broad circumference hung on his shoulders like the moon, whose orb through optic glass the Tuscan artist views at evening from atop of Fesole or in Valdarno to descry new lands, rivers, or mountains in her spotty globe. His spear, to equal which the tallest pine hewn on Norwegian hills to be the mast of some great admiral were but a wand. He walked with no support, uneasy steps over the burning marl, not like those steps on heaven's azure, and the torrid climes smote on him sore besides, vaulted with fire. None the less he so endured, till on the beach of that inflamed sea he stood and called his legions, angel forms who lay entranced, thick as autumnal leaves that strew the brooks in Vallombrosa, where the Etrurian shades high overarched embower, or scattered sedge afloat, when with fierce winds Orion armed hath vexed the Red Sea coast, whose waves o'erthrew Busiris and his Memphian chivalry, while with perfidious hatred they pursued the sojourners of Goshen, who beheld from the safe shore the floating carcasses and broken chariot wheels. So thick bestrewn, abject, and lost lay these, covering the flood, under amazement of their hideous change. He called so loud that all the hollow deep of hell resounded. Princes, potentates, warriors, the flower of heaven, once yours, now lost, if such astonishment as this can seize eternal spirits, or have ye chosen this place after the toil of battle to repose your wearied virtue, for the ease you find to slumber here as in the vales of heaven? Or in this abject posture have ye sworn to adore the conqueror, who now beholds cherub and seraph rolling in the flood with scattered arms and ensigns, till anon his swift pursuers from heaven gates discern the advantage, and descending tread us down thus drooping, or with linked thunderbolts transfix us to the bottom of this gulf. Awake, arise, or be forever fallen. They heard, and were abashed, and up they sprung upon the wing, as when men wont to watch on duty, sleeping found by whom they dread, rouse and bestir themselves, ere well awake. Nor did they perceive the evil plight in which they were, or the fierce pains not feel, yet to their general's voice they soon obeyed innumerable. As when the potent rod of Amram's son in Egypt's evil day waved round the coast, upcalled a pitchy cloud of locusts, warping on the eastern wind, that o'er the realm of impious Pharaoh hung like night, and darkened all the land of Nile. So numberless were these bad angels seen, hovering on wing under the cope of hell, twixt upper, nether, and surrounding fires, till, as a signal given, the uplifted spear of their great sultan waving to direct their course, in even balance down they light on the firm brimstone, and fill all the plain, a multitude, like which the populous north poured never from her frozen loins, to pass Rhine or the Danau, when her barbarous sons came like a deluge on the south, and spread beneath Gibraltar to the Libyan sands. Forthwith, from every squadron and each band, the heads and leaders thither haste where stood their great commander, godlike shapes and forms excelling human, princely dignities, and powers that erst in heaven sat on thrones, though of their names in heavenly records now be no memorial, blotted out and razed by their rebellion from the books of life. Nor had they yet among the sons of Eve got them new names, till wandering o'er the earth through God's high sufferance for the trial of man, by falsities and lies, the greatest part of mankind they corrupted to forsake, God their Creator, and the invisible glory of Him that made them, to transform oft to the image of a brute, adorned with gay religions full of pomp and gold, and devils to adore for deities. Then were they known to men by various names and various idols through the heathen world. Say, Muse, their names then known, who first, who last, roused from the slumber, on that fiery couch at their great emperor's call, as next in worth came singly from where he stood on the bare strand, while the promiscuous crowd stood yet aloof. The chief were those who from the pit of hell, roaming to seek their prey on earth, durst fix their seats long after next the seat of God, their altars by his altar, gods adored among the nations round, and durst abide Jehovah thundering out of Sion, throned between the cherubim, yea, often placed within his sanctuary itself their shrines, abominations, and with cursed things his holy rites and solemn feasts profaned, and with their darkness durst affront his light. First, Moloch, horrid king, besmeared with blood of human sacrifice, and parents' tears, though for the noise of drums and timbrels loud their children's cries unheard, that passed through fire to his grim idol. Him the Ammonite worshipped in Rabbah and her watery plain, in Argob and in Basan, to the stream of utmost Arnon. Nor content with such audacious neighborhood, the wisest heart of Solomon he led by fraud to build his temple right against the temple of God on that opprobrious hill, and made his grove the pleasant valley of Hinnom, Tophet thence and black Gehenna called, the type of hell. Next, Chemos, the obscene dread of Moab's sons, from Aror to Nebo, and in the wild of southmost Abarim, in Hezebon and Horonaim, Sion's realm, beyond the flowery dale of Sibma, clad with vines, and Elil to the Asphiatic pool. Peor, his other name, when he enticed Israel in Sittim, on their march from Nile, to do him wanton rites which cost them woe. Yet thence his lustful orgies he enlarged, even to that hill of scandal, by the grove of Moloch homicide, lust hard by hate, till good Josiah drove them thence to hell. With these came they, who from the bordering flood of old Euphrates to the brook that parts Egypt from Syrian ground, had general names of Baalim and Ashratoth, those male, these feminine. For spirits, when they please, can either sex assume, or both. So soft and uncompounded is their essence pure, not tied or manacled with joint or limb, nor founded on the brittle strength of bones like cumbrous flesh, but in what shape they choose, dilated or condensed, bright or obscure, can execute their airy purposes, and works of love or enmity fulfill. For those the race of Israel oft forsook their living strength, and unfrequented left his righteous altar, bowing lowly down to bestial gods, and which their heads as low bowed down in battle sunk before the spear of despicable foes. With these in troop came Astoreth, whom the Phoenicians called Astarte, queen of heaven, with crescent horns, to whose bright image nightly by moon Sidonian virgins paid their vows and songs. In Sion also not unsung, where stood her temple on the offensive mountain, built by that uxorious king, whose heart, though large, beguiled by fair adulteresses, fell to idols foul. Thammuz came next behind, whose annual wound in Lebanon allured the Syrian damsels to lament his fate in amorous ditties all a summer's day, while smooth Adonis from his native rock ran purple to the sea, supposed with blood of Thammuz yearly wounded. The love tale infected Sion's daughters with like heat, whose wanton passions in the sacred porch Ezekiel saw, when by the visions led his eye surveyed the dark idolatries of alienated Judah. Next came one who mourned in earnest, when the captive ark maimed his brute image, heads and hands lopped off in his own temple, on the groundsel edge, where he fell flat and shamed his worshippers. Dagon, his name, sea monster, upward man and downward fish, yet had his temple high reared in Azotus, dreaded through the coast of Palestine, in Gath and Ascalon and Acheron and Gaza's frontier bounds. Him followed Rimmon, whose delightful seat was fair Damascus, on the fertile banks of Abana and Pharphar, lucid streams. He also against the house of God was bold. A leper once he lost, and gained a king. Ahaz, his sottish conqueror, whom he drew God's altar to disparage and displace for one of Syrian mode, whereon to burn his odious offerings and adore the gods whom he had vanquished. After these appeared a crew who, under names of old renown, Osiris, Isis, Horus, and their train, with monstrous shapes and sorceries abused, fanatic Egypt and her priests, to seek their wandering gods disguised in brutish forms rather than human. Nor did Israel scape the infection when their borrowed gold composed the calf in Oreb, and the rebel king doubled that sin in Bethel and in Dan, likening his maker to the grazed ox Jehovah, who in one night, when he passed from Egypt marching, equalled with one stroke both her firstborn and all her bleating gods. Belial came last, of whom a spirit more lewd fell not from heaven, or more gross to love vice for itself. To him no temple stood or altar smoked, yet who more oft than he in temples and at altars, when the priest turns atheist, as did Eli's sons, who filled with lust and violence the house of God. In courts and palaces he also reigns, and in luxurious cities, where the noise of riot ascends above their loftiest towers, and injury and outrage. And when night darkens the streets, then wander forth the sons of Belial, flown with insolence and wine. Witness the streets of Sodom, and that night in Gibeah, when the hospitable door opened a matron to avoid worse rape. These were the prime in order and in might. The rest were long to tell, though far renowned. The Ionian gods of Javan's issue held gods, yet confessed later than heaven and earth their boasted parents. Titan heaven's firstborn with his enormous brood, and birthright seized by younger Saturn, he who from mightier Jove his own and Rhea's son like measure found. So Jove usurping reigned, those first in Crete and Ida known, thence on the snowy top of cold Olympus ruled the middle air their highest heaven, or on the Delphian cliff, or in Dodona, and through all the bounds of Doric land, or who with Saturn old fled over Adria to the Hesperian fields, and o'er the Celtic roamed the utmost isles. All these and more came flocking, but with looks downcast and damp, yet such wherein appeared obscure some glimpse of joy, to have found their chief, not in despair, but to have found themselves not lost in loss itself, which on his countenance cast like doubtful hue. But he, his wonted pride soon recollecting, with high words that bore semblance of worth, not substance, gently raised their fainting courage and dispelled their fears. Then straight commands that at the warlike sound of trumpets loud and clarions be upreared his mighty standard, that proud honour claimed Azazel as his right, a cherub tall, who forthwith from the glittering staff unfurled the imperial ensign, which full high advanced shone like a meteor streaming to the wind, with gems and golden lustre rich emblazed, seraphic arms and trophies, all the while sonorous metal blowing martial sounds, at which the universal host upsent a shout that tore hell's conclave, and beyond frightened the reign of chaos and old night. All in a moment, though the gloom were seen, 10,000 banners rise into the air, with orient colours waving. With them rose a huge forest of spears, and thronging helms appeared, and serried shields in thick array of depth immeasurable. Anon they move in perfect phalanx to the Dorian mode of flutes and soft recorders, such as raised to the height of noblest temper heroes old, arming to battle, and instead of rage, deliberate valor breathed, firm and unmoved, with dread of death to flight or foul retreat, nor wanting power to mitigate and swage with solemn touches troubled thoughts, and chase anguish and doubt and fear and sorrow and pain from mortal or immortal minds. Thus they, breathing united force with fixed thought, moved on in silence to soft pipes that charmed their painful steps over the burnt soil, and now advanced in view they stand, a horrid front of dreadful length and dazzling arms, in guise of warriors old with ordered spear and shield, awaiting what command their mighty chief had to impose. He, through the armoured flies, darts his experienced eye, and soon traverse the whole battalion views, their order due, their visages and stature as of gods, their number last he sums. And now his heart distends with pride, and hardening in his strength glories, for never since created man met such embodied force, as named with these could merit more than small infantry warred on by cranes. Though all the giant brood of Phlegro with the heroic race were joined that fought at Thebes and Ilium, on each side mixed with auxiliar gods, and what resounds in fable or romance of Uthor's son, begirt with British and Armoric knights, and all who since, baptized or infidel, jousted in Aspremont or Montalban, Damasco or Morocco or Trebizond, or whom Bizerta sent from Afric shore when Charlemagne with all his peerage fell by Fontarabia. Thus far these beyond compare of mortal prowess, yet observed their dread commander. He, above the rest, in shape and gesture proudly eminent, stood like a tower. His form had yet not lost all her original brightness, nor appeared less than archangel ruined, and the excess of glory obscured. And when the sun, new risen, looks through the horizontal misty air shorn of his beams, or from behind the moon in dim eclipse disastrous twilight sheds on half the nations, and with fear of change perplexes monarchs, darkened so, yet shone above them all the archangel, but his face deep scars of thunder had entrenched, and care sat on his faded cheek, but under brows of dauntless courage, and considerable pride wanting revenge. Cruel his eye, but cast signs of remorse and passion to behold the fellows of his crime, the followers rather, for other once beheld in bliss, condemned forever now to have their lot in pain. Millions of spirits for his fault immersed of heaven, and from eternal splendors flung for his revolt, yet faithful now they stood, their glory withered. As when heaven's fire hath scathed the forest oaks or mountain pines, with singed top their stately growth though bare stands on the blasted heath. He now prepared to speak, whereat their doubled ranks they bend from wing to wing, and half enclose him round with all his peers. Attention held them mute. Thrice he essayed, and thrice in a spite of scorn, tears such as angels weep burst forth. At last words interwove with sighs found out their way. O myriads of immortal spirits, O powers matchless, but with Almighty, and that strife was not inglorious, though the event was dire, as this place testifies, and this dire change hateful to utter. But what power of mind, foreseeing or presaging from the depth of knowledge past or present, could have feared how such united force of gods, how such as stood like these, could ever know repulse? For who can yet believe, though after loss, that all these puissant legions, whose exile hath emptied heaven, shall fail to reascend, self-raised, and repossess their native seat? For me be witness all the host of heaven, if counsels different or danger shunned, by me have lost our hopes. But he who reigns monarch in heaven, till then as one secure sat on his throne, upheld by old repute, consent, or custom, and his regal state put forth at full, but still his strength concealed, which tempted our attempt and wrought our fall. Henceforth his might we know, and know our own, so as not to either or provoke or dread new war provoked. Our better part remains to work in close design, by fraud or guile, what force effected not. Not he, that he no less at length from us may find, who overcomes by force hath overcome but half his foe. Space may produce new worlds, whereof so rife there went a fame in heaven that he ere long intended to create, and therein plant a generation, whom his choice regard should favour equal to the sons of heaven. Thither, if but to pry, shall be perhaps our first eruption, thither or elsewhere, for this infernal pit shall never hold celestial spirits in bondage, nor the abyss long under darkness cover. But these thoughts full counsel must mature. Peace is despaired, for who can think submission? War, then, war, open or understood, must be resolved. He spake, and to confirm his words, out flew millions of flaming swords, drawn from the thighs of mighty cherubim. The sudden blaze far round illuminated hell. Highly they raged against the highest, and fierce with grasped arms clashed on their sounding shields the din of war, hurling defiance against the vault of heaven. There stood a hill not far, whose grisly top belched fire and rolling smoke. The rest entire shone with a glossy scurf, undoubted sign that in his womb was hid metallic ore, the work of sulphur. Thither winged with speed a numerous brigade hastened, as when bands of pioneers with spade and pickaxe armed forerun the royal camp to trench a field or cast a rampart. Mammon led them on. Mammon, the least erected spirit that fell from heaven, for even in heaven his looks and thoughts were always downward bent, admiring more the riches of heaven's pavement, trodden gold, that aught divine or holy else enjoyed in vision beatific. By him first, men also, and by his suggestion taught, ransacked the centre, and with impious hands rifled the bowels of their mother earth, for treasures better hid. Soon had his crew opened into the hill a spacious wound and digged out ribs of gold. Let none admire that riches grow in hell, that soil may best deserve the precious bane. And here let these who boast in mortal things and wandering tell of Babel, and the works of Memphian kings, learn how their greatest monuments of fame and strength and art are easily outdone by spirits reprobate. And in an hour, what in an age they with incessant toil and hands innumerable scarce perform. Nigh on the plain in many cells prepared, that underneath had veins of liquid fire sluiced from the lake. A second multitude with wondrous art founded the massy ore, severing each kind, and scummed the bullion dross. A third as soon had formed within the ground a various mould, and from the boiling cells by strange conveyance filled each hollow nook, as in an organ, from one blast of wind to many a row of pipes the soundboard breathes. Anon out of the earth a fabric huge rose like an exhalation, with a sound of dulcet symphonies and voices sweet, built like a temple, where pilasters round were set, and Doric pillars overlaid with golden architrave. Nor did there want cornice or frieze, with bossy sculptures graven. The roof was fretted gold. Not Babylon, nor great Al-Cairo with such magnificence, equalled in all their glories, to enshrine Belus or Serapis their gods, or seat their kings, when Egypt with Assyria strove in wealth and luxury. The ascending pile soon fixed her stately height, and straight the doors opening, their brazen folds discover wide within her ample spaces, o'er the smooth and level pavement, from the arched roof, pendant by subtle magic, many a row of starry lamps and blazing cressets fed with naphtha and asphaltus yielded light as from a sky. The hasty multitude, admiring, entered, and the work some praise and some the architect. His hand was known in heaven by many a towered structure high, where sceptred angels held their residence and sat as princes, whom the supreme king exalted to such power, and gave to rule, each in his hierarchy, the orders bright. Nor was his name unheard or unadored in ancient Greece, and in Iusian land men called him Mulciber, and how he fell from heaven, they fabled, thrown by angry Jove sheer o'er the crystal battlements. From morn to noon he fell, from noon to dewy eve, a summer's day, and with the setting sun dropped from the zenith like a falling star. On Lemnos, the Aegean isle, thus they relate, erring, for he with this rebellious rout fell long before, nor aught availed him now to have built in heaven high towers, nor did he scape by all his engines, but was headlong sent with his industrious crew to build in hell. Meanwhile, the winged heralds by command of sovereign power, with awful ceremony and trumpets sound throughout the host proclaim a solemn council forthwith to be held at Pandemonium, the high capital of Satan and his peers. Their summon called from every band and squared regiment, by place or choice the worthiest. They anon, with hundreds and with thousands trooping came, attended. All access was thronged, the gates and porches wide, but chief the spacious hall, though like a covered field where champions bold wont ride in armed, and at the Soldan's chair defied the best Paynim chivalry to mortal combat or career with lance. Thick swarmed, both on the ground and in the air, brushed with the hiss of rustling wings, as bees in springtime, when the sun with Taurus rides, pour forth their populous youth about the hive in clusters. They among fresh dews and flowers fly to and fro, or on the smoothed plank, the suburb of their straw-built citadel, new rubbed with balm, expatiate and confer their state affairs. So thick the airy crowd swarmed and was straitened, till the signal given, behold a wonder! They but now who seemed in bigness to surpass earth's giant sons, now less than smallest dwarfs, in narrow room throng numberless, like that pygmean race beyond the Indian mount, or fairy elves, whose midnight revels by a forest side or fountain some belated peasant sees, or dreams he sees, while overhead the moon sits arbitress, and nearer to the earth wheels her pale course. They on their mirth and dance intent, with jocund music charm his ear, at once with joy and fear his heart rebounds. Thus incorporeal spirits to smallest forms reduced their shapes immense, and were at large, though without number, still amidst the hall of that infernal court. But far within, and in their own dimensions, like themselves, the great seraphic lords and cherubim, in close recess and secret conclave, sat 1,000 demigods on golden seats, frequent and full. After short silence then, and summons read, the great consult began. End Book 1.